The Church in Latin America today. The Church's history in Latin America started with the colonization by the Spanish. Under the rule of King Ferdinand, much of the continent was under the Spanish control and became a part of the Spanish Empire. Through colonization, many missionaries were brought to the New World, and with that, new rules. The requerimiento was a legal doctrine mandating that the new Native Americans accept the Spanish monarch's power over the region and Christianity. The doctrine called for the Native Americans who abided by these demands to be considered loyal vassals, but justified war against the Native Americans if they opposed the Spaniards' power and allowed for an aggressive conquest, resulting in the Native Americans being deprived of their liberty and property. Slavery was also a part of the local population's culture before the arrival of the conquistadors. Christian missionaries provided existing slaves with an opportunity to escape their situation by seeking out the protection of the missions.
One of the first missionary groups that came to Latin America were the Franciscans. They were responsible for initiating the organized effort to evangelize the native people of Mexico. Their views of the religious beliefs of the Native Americans and their evangelization strategies are highlighted in a letter from Friar Francisco Angelorum. Angelorum concluded that the Native Americans' idols were a result of being deceived by satanic wiles, that about the eternal Father and spiritual salvation are the best means for evangelizing them. Over the next 150 years, missions expanded into southwestern North America. Native people were often legally defined as children, and priests took on a parentalistic role, sometimes enforced with corporal punishment.
Another missionary that came with the colonization was the Dominicans. The Dominicans advocated for the Native Americans' rights. Pedro de Gante and Bartolome de las Casas were two of the most famous Dominican missionaries in Latin America. De Gante and de las Casas were both critical of the Spanish colonists' treatment of the Native Americans. De las Casas wrote in defense of the Native Americans to advocate for the Native Americans' rights. Group to come over was the Jesuits. Jesuit missions in Latin America were controversial in Europe, especially in Spain and Portugal. Jesuits were often the only force standing between the Native Americans and slavery. Jesuits founded several towns in Brazil in the 16th century, including Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Jesuit reductions were a particular version of the general Catholic strategy used in the 17th and 18th centuries of building reductions in order to Christianize the indigenous populations of the Americas more efficiently. The Jesuit reductions achieved a high degree of autonomy with the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires. With the use of Indian labor, the reductions became economically successful. When their existence was threatened by the incursions of bandeirante slave traders, Indian militia were created that fought effectively against the colonists.
In the 19th century, anti-clericalism was an integral feature of liberalism in Latin America. This anti-clericalism was based on the idea that the clergy were hindering social progress. Beginning in the 1820s, a succession of liberal regimes came to power in Latin America. Some members of these liberal regimes sought to imitate the Spain of the 1830s in exploiting the wealth of the Catholic Church.
The Mexican Constitution of 1824 had required the Republic to prohibit the exercise of any religion other than the Roman Catholic and Apostolic faith. Later on, starting in 1855 and later known as the Reform War, Mexican President Benito Juarez issued decrees nationalizing church property, preparing church and state, and suppressing religious institutes. Church properties were confiscated and basic civil and political rights were denied to religious institutes and the clergy. The church supported the regime of Juarez's successor, Porfirio Diaz, who was opposed to land reform. The first of the liberal reform laws were passed in 1855. The Juarez Law, named after Benito Juarez, restricted clerical privileges, specifically the authority of church courts, by subverting their authority to civil law. The next reform law was called the Lerdo Law. after Miguel Lerdo de Tejera. Under this new law, the government began to confiscate church land. The Lerdo law proved to be considerably more controversial than the Portis law. The purpose of the law was to convert lands held by corporate entities, such as the church, into private property, favoring those who already lived on it. It was thought that such would encourage development and the government could raise revenue by taxing the process.
Later on, the Mexican Revolution of 1910 led to the enactment of the Mexican Constitution of 1917, which furthered anti-clerical provisions. Many of these provisions were resisted, leading to the Siestro Rebellion of 1927. The suppression of the church included the closing of many churches and the killing and forced marriage of priests. The persecution was most severe in Tabasco under the atheist governor Tomas Garrido Canabal. An armed conflict in the form of a popular uprising broke out against the anti-Catholic Mexican government and set off specifically by the anti-clerical provisions of the Mexican Constitution of 1917. The conflict is known as the Cristero War. The Cristero War was eventually resolved diplomatically, largely with the influence of the U.S. ambassadors. In the 1960s, liberation theology emerged in response to social awareness and politicalization in the Latin American church. Liberation theology is the idea that liberation from social, political, and economic oppression as an anticipation of ultimate salvation. This theology was made popular in Latin America as many people live in poor conditions. This theology openly supported anti-imperialist movements and sought to champion the poor. One archbishop became famous as he supported this theology. His name was Oscar Romero. Unfortunately, not everyone liked this theology, and Archbishop Oscar Romero was murdered while saying Mass in 1980.